Hello everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to the channel. In this video, this is going to be one of a few that I'm going to be putting out here that's going to cover some prerequisite material or foundational material that we're going to need when putting together PowerShell scripts. So in here we're going to talk about arrays, variables, PowerShell objects, hash tables. So we'll get into working with variables, creating a variable as an array or an array list, constructing a hash table, and finally creating a PowerShell object. So to begin, let's talk a bit about working with variables. Let me change over to my lab environment here. And when we're working with these concepts here that we're going to need for scripting, there's some things we need to kind of keep in mind here about why it might be necessary. So first of all, the concept of creating a script. So typically when you're creating a script, you are going to be running multiple lines of code. And what PowerShell does when it executes each line of code is it works the output of each of those lines into its own pipeline, if you will. And then at the end of each line, if there's data left in the pipeline, it gets outputted to the screen of the PowerShell console that you're running the script from. So it doesn't, by default, hold on to that output. So if you type in something like this, where I do get service, main bits, something like this, uh, once the data hits the screen, it's lost from PowerShell's pipeline. Now imagine you're running this line of code in a script and you want to hold on to that output to use it later on in the script. That's where variables can come into play. So we can use them to hold on to the output of a command line to then be able to reuse it later on if we wanted to do that. So with variables in PowerShell, they are typically created on the fly, if you will. So ad hoc variables, I believe is the proper term for it, but I might be wrong on that. But anyway, so you create them. Now, usually one of the things though, before I get into doing variables, is I usually like to see if there's already one there that might cover what I need. So for instance, in PowerShell, if you type in get PS drive, you can see on most PowerShell computers, I'm not going to say it's going to be on all, but it's pretty much on every one I've ever looked at, you could see there is a variable drive. And that is populated with whatever variables have been established in this PowerShell session. Right? So like for instance, if I close this and we'll open up a fresh PowerShell session here and go and display that variable drive by doing get child item and it's variable colon, helps you spell variable, right? Like so. And notice in a freshly launched PowerShell session, there are some variables defined here. Okay, so most of these are coming in just by launching a PowerShell session. So they're referred to as automatic variables. And there is an about topic for them in help if you wanted to see what those were. So if you want to look at help, and then the name of the help topic you're looking for would be about underscore automatic variables. And you could go ahead and breeze through that and see literally what all of the variables are that are defined there. All right. So again, to bring this list back up here, these are ones that have already been defined. So like I remember one time when I was first learning PowerShell, I had wrote a script that used a variable that I thought I was making up, $host, but it turns out it was already defined. So that kind of messed up my script, if you will. So you can use this. Let's say if I look at $host, you can put a $sign in front of the name of the variable, and that will then enumerate the contents of that variable. So I'll display it out onto the screen here, or put it into PowerShell's pipeline, one or the other. All right. Now, if you wanted to make your own, it can be just as simple as maybe we'll do $A equals 1, right? Something like that. And we can put an object in there. So if I look at $A now, we can see it's a value of 1, right? So that is creating a variable on the fly and assigning a value to it. And as long as that variable isn't used by anything else, you're good to go there. So what can you name variables with? So you can use any number of combination of lowercase letters, uppercase letters, numbers, and underscores, okay, are the acceptable symbols. So I know you can make variable names with other weird symbols if you enclose them in a set of curly brackets, but probably just simpler just to stick with letters, numbers, and underscores, right? Um, so now with this, if I want, I could, make another variable, $B equals 2. And what's being put in there would be the same as if you typed whatever that is into a regular command line and executed it. Okay, so if I look at that 2 and I pipe it to get member, that would be me putting an integer into the pipeline. So if we go look at the variable and pipe it to get member, we can see it's got the same stuff in it, right? So with a variable, it's not just storing like text and numbers that we put in, it's typing them as PowerShell, as not PowerShell, as .NET objects. So everything that goes in there is the result of that. And as such, you could even put into there, let's go back to my bits one here. You can put things into there that are the result of command output. So if I do maybe $S here and do that, and if I look at $S, there was my output. And in fact, if I pipe it to get member, okay, I can see that that's the type of object that is in that variable. Okay. So you can put the results of some type of output in there. You can put, when I did $A equals 1, that was putting a string in there. You could also put text. So if I do $name equals Mike, and that would now have a string object that's in that variable, right? So you're able to do that. Now with it, we could place other things in there as well. So like if you notice though, like because this was in quotes, if I take $name and pipe it to get member, it automatically assigned that object as a string object. Okay, just like when I did $A equals 1, it automatically assigned it as an integer. So when you put things in variables, sometimes there is, if you're not specifying it, there is an automatic typing that's happening to it, like defining what type of object it is. And sometimes that gets messed up. Okay, that gets messed up. So for instance, if I do $date equals, and then what's today? So at the time of this video, it is 5/10/2022, right? So let's say that's what I want to put in there. And I want PowerShell to treat it as a date time object. So I go ahead and I do that. And if I look at $date, it's anything but a date. Okay, what PowerShell did is it actually treated this as like a math operation. Okay, so it took 5 divided by the /, that's also a divide symbol in when it comes to working with integers. So 5 divided by 10 divided by 2022, right, is basically how that's being read. Right, now if I try and cast it like this, right, PowerShell is going to treat that as a string. So if I look at $date, it's just spitting out the string. Okay, so if I pipe it to get member, it's going to be a string object. In fact, you can actually on variables, there is a get type method on them that you can call. Just like we were using the $_ stuff from videos that we saw earlier, I can run the get type method and again can see what's in there. Okay, so that's not what I want either. It's a string object. I wanted a date time object. So with a variable, when you're defining it, you could define what type of object you want. So if I want to cast this as a date time object, the variable $date and then the value there, and I go ahead and enter that. And if I now look at $date, you could see, hey, it figured it out as a date time object. And in fact, if I do the get type, we can see there is in fact a date time object in there. If you don't remember that method, again, just sticking with stuff you already know, you could pipe it to get member. Um, and again, you could see date time object as well. All right. So that's something to note when it comes to variables. Remember the variable represents a .NET object. So using a dot as a separator, you can individually call methods on that object or properties on that object. So for instance, like if I did $name, which again had my name in it, if I do $name.length, that's calling the length property, if I could type here, that's calling the length property of what that string is, which in this case is 4, because that makes sense, right? I have 4 characters in there. Okay? And I could also call maybe the toUpper method, and that would take the string and flip all the characters to uppercase. Okay, so you have this ability to directly access the property values or the methods on that object. And we call that, we're enumerating it. Okay, so if you look in my videos, there is one I have posted, working with objects part 2, which gets into selecting versus enumerating. So with a variable, because the variable has the objects in it, you can directly enumerate them. So directly grab the values out of the properties or call the methods. All right. Now, if a variable has a number in it, you can also do some tricks with the variable as well. Like if I look at $A, notice it's a value of 1. If I do $A plus plus like this, and then do $A, I incremented the number that was in there by 1. And likewise, if I do minus minus and then look at $A, I can see it's back down to the number 1 again. Okay, so you can, in essence, make a crude counter out of it. So you can increment it by 1 or subtract by 1. Now you could also, let's say $A plus equal, and let's pick a number. Let's just say 4. Okay, so if I do that and then I look at $A, notice it took what was in there, added this, and stored the result back into that variable. So you don't always have to, count up by 1 or count down by 1. So you could also do math here. You could do plus equal, minus equal. This symbol right here is multiply. So your wildcard or your asterisk is multiply, and the forward slash is divide. So if you did like like something like that, that would be multiply equal, and then slash equal, that would be a divide equal. Right? So you can do those math operations as well if you wanted to. Right? Now, with something like this, I've been working with variables that have single objects in them. Right? So that might be what some of the stories are here when it comes to working with variables. Now, in some cases, though, you might want to work with variables that have, or you will be working with variables that have multiple objects in them. So those variables are known as arrays. So for instance here, like let's say I have get service name, let's just grab a few services like so. So I've got 4 things here, 4 objects, in this case 4 service controllers. And let's say I want to put this in a variable. So let's call this $SCRV equals this. Right? So go ahead and run it. And I think I still had a $S, which just had a single service in it. Okay, cool. So if we did a $s and we called the getType method on it, okay, we could see that it's a service controller. Okay, so that tells me that there's one thing in there. Now, let me do the same trick with $serv, and we'll call the getType method as well. And notice how it changes. See how it's saying there's multiple objects in there, and this thing is an array. So an array means you have multiple objects in there. So this has to be defined when the variable is created. Okay, so like for instance, you take this $s right here, this was created as a variable that had a single object in it, so it's not an array. Whereas this, at creation, multiple objects were put in there, so it was cast as an array. Okay, so if you're putting multiple things in there when the variable is being defined, it will be defined as an array. Okay, now it will still have the correct objects in it, don't get me wrong. So if I take $serv and pipe it to get member, I can see that, hey, there is, service controller objects in there. Okay, and if I wanted to see how many, you can send it over to measure object. That could tell you how many objects are in that variable. And there is a property that comes on pretty much every variable. It's the count property. Right? And that can also tell you how many things are in there. Right? So, so I don't know, what's quicker to do? Measure object or just, grab the data out of the count property. Okay? So that's one of these. Count is a hidden property that's available on all variables, starting with PowerShell 3 and newer, I believe. All right? So it's been around for a bit. All right? Now, what's also interesting with variables that are arrays is you can get particular rows out of them. So if you kind of look at this as like almost like a table, right, where you have, columns and then each object represents a row, you can go call the first row by doing bracket 0 bracket, and that will display like so. And you could grab the last one by doing -1, okay, and getting that. So if I wanted to grab, something, something into that way. Okay. So if you wanted like I don't know, the second to last, it would be -2. And if you wanted the second, it would be the number 1. So it's kind of weird that the last starts at -1 and the beginning starts at 0. And then if you want the next one from there, it's just increment like so. Right? So you can call these different position values. And what's kind of even better here is you can then still enumerate things as well. So if I just wanted the in essence, the second object in that variable, and I wanted just the value out of the name property, I can just get that. Okay, so I'm able to do that. And you could also call methods the same way. So if you wanted to grab that variable and then call the start method, you could do that. And it would only work on this particular object in that variable. All right? Um, so so we can work with these positions, if you will, to get the information that we're looking for. Right? Um, Okay, so now let's say though I wanted to make my own array. So let's say you're running a script which maybe has a loop in it, and you're gathering one piece of information at a time in your loop, and you want to add it to a variable. So that means the variable has to be cast as an array. So an easy way to do this is you could start here. Let's do $array, which doesn't exist yet, so there's nothing in it. So $array equals, and then we'll do an @ and an open and a close parenthesis. So that now casts, if I do that $array, and we'll call the getType method on it, you could see it casts it as an array. There's nothing in it at the moment, but it has cast it as an array. And now at this point, I could then do a plus equal and then put things into there. So maybe we'll do 1, put that in there. And then we'll do 2, put that in there. Okay, and if I look at $array, okay, it is taking them in one at a time, right? So there's actually 2 objects in there. So if I do $array.count, I can see, oops, I can see from here 2 objects in there. So you could define an empty array and then add things into it one at a time. So it works great when you're putting together looping constructs that have to add something in one at a time. Kind of works rather well, right? Now, the problem, though, with how PowerShell handles arrays is they are, believe it or not, their membership list is read-only by default. So what that means is every time you add something to an array, the contents of the array have to be pulled into memory, the value added on to the end of it, and then the whole thing cast back into that variable. Okay, so we have to pull the whole thing open, add the next item onto the end, and then cast the whole thing back into that variable. All right, so that takes time. Now, if you're working with, arrays as variables, and you're working with like, I don't know, less than maybe 1,000 objects in it, probably not going to make a difference to timing. So the script maybe takes 2 seconds to run instead of 1 second to run, something like that. But let's say you're putting thousands of objects into an array, one at a time. Um, if you were doing, I think it's like, I don't know, like 10,000 objects, adding them in one at a time into an array, probably take the script about 10 seconds to do that. So in PowerShell, there is another type of object that you could create that's called an array list. Okay, so an array list allows me to create a, a different type of way of storing multiple objects, and an array list is better performing, if you will. Okay, so PowerShell though doesn't really have a commandlet for that. So instead, I'll just do AL for array list here. And so what you do is you define it by doing a new object, and it would be out of the systems.collections.arraylist class, and that would then make your array list here. All right. I did systems, my bad. Should be system. There we go. Okay. So yeah, system.collections.arraylist. And then I can go and add things to that. So first of all, I take $AL and do a get type. You could see that is an array list. And then for that array list, $AL, there is an add method to it, and I could specify, what I wanted to add. So in this case, I want to add the string 1. Okay, put that in there, and do the string 2, add that in there. Okay, so when you add something in using the add method, the output that shows up on the screen will give you an index of where it was added to. So this was the first object in there, this was the second object in there, and so on. If you don't want that outputting to the screen, you could take the result you're doing and pipe it to out null. And that just won't tell you the index number that it put it in there, but it did definitely go in. So you can see there it is there. All right. But, because this is outputting to the screen, you could maybe save that, if you wanted some type of reference for where something went in to that array list, to maybe potentially use it to draw it out later, if I wanted that back out. So it told me 2 went into the 1 position, which is really the second position, and then using that index number, grab it back out. So you could do something like that. So there's also methods here for removing. So there is a remove method and a remove at method as well. So if you wanted to remove, but you didn't know the object you wanted to remove, but you knew the line number that you wanted to remove at, you could do that. Okay? And array lists, if you're working with, again, thousands of objects in there, they perform a lot better. So when I talked earlier about, if you had to put, 10,000 objects into an array one at a time, an array would probably take you about 10 seconds to do that. An array list would probably take about half a second. Okay, so it performs a lot better if we wanted to do that. Right? But typically, though, when we're putting things into arrays or an array list, like when we're doing it, it's typically just one object going in there. So, for instance, like if I look at AL, it's just a bunch of strings in here. Okay, so that's typically what you find in a lot of variables that we tend to create on our own. Okay, a lot of arrays or an array list that we create on our own. Now, the next type of object that we're going to talk about here would be a hash table. So a hash table allows me to do name value pairs and store that. Okay, so let's say, for instance, we wanted to store 2 pieces of information. So one piece is the way to look something up, and then the other piece would be like the actual data value. So the problem with, like, let's say, like an array or an array list, you have to access, things by like their index number. Okay. And that's maybe not something you're going to know all the time. Like, hey, I don't know what index number the value is that I need. So it would be nice if there was some type of key reference to look it up by. So I want a particular value, but I don't know what row that value is in. So that's where potentially a hash table can come into play. Like if you know you're going to be storing a bunch of values, but you want an easy way to look them up, you can create a hash table for it. Right? So what I could do here is maybe we'll do $hash equals, and then a hash table, if you remember from earlier when we did calculated properties, it's just a name value pair. So for instance, let's say I'm going to put computer names and IP addresses in here. So let's say the computer name would be DC1. That's the name of my VM here. And then equals, and then what would be the IP address? Maybe I'll just for ease of typing here, I'll just do 10.1.0.1, let's say. All right, so something like that. So I put that in, and I now have that as a name value pair. So the value is like literally the data you want to store. The name is how you look up that value. Okay, so this is kind of like, the name part over here, that's like the card catalog part, and then the value is what you actually want to get out of it. So once the hash table has been defined, you could again use the add method to add something into it. Okay, but again, with a method, remember the arguments are added inside parentheses. So let's do, let's make one called CL1, and then the value, let's do 10.1.0.2 this time. Okay, and close the argument list. And now if I look at $hash, I now have 2 name value pairs in this hash table. Right? And then I could find them, okay, by using whatever is in the name if I wanted to do that. Okay, so in this case, I could take $hash and dot, and because this is text, I got to put it in quotes. Let's do quote DC1 close quote, and then it gets me the value. So I could tell it, hey, I want, the row that has this name on it, and grab me the value out of that. Okay, so that could be, again, you're using the name as a lookup for where the value is. So instead of having to remember like what row this was on, you can just instead call things by whatever the name is that you happen to use. So that's potentially what a hash table could be of use for if we wanted to do that. Right? Now then, extending this concept out here, well, what if I wanted to save more than 2 rows of information? So what if I wanted a name, a value, and then maybe more things? I wanted, two pieces of information, 3 pieces of information. What can I do for something like that? And that's where, in all honesty, hash tables are not going to work for you. So I know that, actually, no. In other languages, other scripting languages, other programming languages, there may be a reason to create, hash tables that have more than 2 values on, okay? Or more than just a name value pair. However, in PowerShell, we have other things we can use, and that would be putting together objects. So in PowerShell, you have the ability to create your own object if you wanted to do that, and you could put together as many properties as you wanted on it. So let's say, like I wanted something like, the name of the computer, the IP address of the computer, and maybe maybe the type if it was a server or a client or something like that. Okay, so that would be like 3 columns of information. So I can create that by literally making a new PowerShell object. So to do that, let's do dollar. What should be my variable here? Dollar. How about dollar $obj for object? Equals. We'll do new object. The type is going to be PSObject, and then the properties that I want to put on it, you can call the properties in this hash table format. You're not making a hash table, that's how we specify the properties. So the first property, let's say, would be name equals, and then what did I want to call it? Let's do DC1. Then we're going to do a semicolon. The next property we'll do maybe IP equals, and then 10.1.0.1. So we could do something like that. And then semicolon, and then maybe we'll do a type column, type equals server. Okay, something like that. And I go ahead and I run that. And if I look at $obj, there we go. Okay, so we have an object, and in fact, if you pipe this to get member, you can even see you made your own object with these properties on it. Okay, so we could do pretty much whatever we wanted. So every name value pair becomes a property, if you will. Right? And then we could add to that if we wanted to put another object in there. We could do $obj plus equals, and then just create another object, and away we go. Right? So if you're going to do that, though, probably would have been advisable to cast that as an array first. Right? So with this, it still just becomes a single object in there, so you can't really add into that. So cast obj as an array up front, and then you could do plus equals to just keep putting new objects into it. And as long as each object has the same property names, right, you're going to just, in essence, be creating and populating your own array here with as many properties as you want. So it's a very popular trick with PowerShell in scripting to have your script output your own kind of object. And in fact, you can even mess with this right here. Once you have your variable defined that has the object in it, you call the PSObject, let's see, what is it? Type names dot insert method, and then we'll do 0, comma, and then whatever you want to call your object. So maybe just my object. and then run that. And if I take $obj, it doesn't look any different to output it. However, you pipe it to get member, right? Before it was this PS custom object, and notice now I modified the type name so it's now my own type of object, which might come in handy if you're making your own scripts that produce your own objects that you're going to want to use for your own purposes. So having your own object allows you to potentially define your own views for it, your own output types. There's a few things you can do with it, right? So, and just, throwing that bit of code on there allows me to do that, right? So it's kind of the beauty of creating your own object. You can pick what property, how many properties you want, what you want to name those properties, and what you wanted to name the object that you are producing, right? So that's a pretty useful trick there. So for people that want to know, like, hey, how do I create, hash tables with more than 2 columns in them? Well, in PowerShell, you really don't. You just create PowerShell objects, and that gives you a lot more functionality to it. All right. So that is having a look here at some of the different constructs for our beginning into scripting. So our scripting prereqs. So we looked at working with variables that potentially have single objects in them, like a string or an integer or a date. If we have multiple things in them, creating variables as arrays or array lists, constructing a hash table, to have a name value pair, potentially useful when you want to look something up. I want to look a value up, but I don't remember what row it's on. So a hash table could be great for that, where you have a name value pair. And then finally, when you need more values than a hash table can do, creating your very own PowerShell object. All right. So if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. And any questions, feel free to post something down in chat. I'd be happy to have a look at it. And once again, thank you for viewing, and be on the lookout for the next video in my scripting prereq series here, where we'll get into scripting constructs. All right, so thanks for viewing, and we'll see you then.